In 1720, the richest man in the world fled Paris in a borrowed coach. He had no money, he had no title. He left behind the ruins of what had been, for exactly 4 years, the most ambitious economic experiment in history. His name was John Law. He was a Scottish murderer, a professional gambler, and the man who invented modern paper money. He had convinced France, one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world, to hand him complete control of their economy. And for a while, it worked better than anyone had ever dreamed. And then it collapsed, taking 500,000 investors with it. This is the story of the first great financial crash in modern history, and why we are still living in its shadow. To understand why France was willing to give a foreign gambler control of their economy, you need to understand what France looked like in 1715. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the most powerful monarch in Europe, had just died. He had ruled France for 72 years, the longest reign of any major monarch in European history, and he had left the kingdom in ruins. France's national debt stood at approximately 3 billion livres, roughly equivalent to 10 times the kingdom's annual revenue. The treasury was empty, the tax system was broken, nobles and clergy paid almost nothing while the peasantry was bled dry. Interest payments on existing debt were consuming every franc of incoming tax revenue. The new king, Louis XV, was 7 years old. The regent, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, was desperate. He had tried conventional solutions. He had debased the currency. He had called assemblies of creditors and negotiated partial defaults. Nothing worked. France was on the verge of complete financial collapse. Into this situation walked John Law. John Law was born in Edinburgh in 1671. His father was a goldsmith and banker. By the time Law was 20, he had absorbed everything he could about money, credit, and trade. He was also a gambler. Not a casual one. He was one of the finest card players in Europe, skilled enough that some contemporaries accused him of cheating, though none could prove it. He understood probability, risk, and the psychology of speculation as well as anyone alive. In 1694, Law fought a duel in London over a woman. He killed his opponent, a man named Edward Wilson. He was convicted of murder, sentenced to death, and escaped from prison, the only man known to have done so from London's King's Bench. He spent the next 20 years moving across Europe: Amsterdam, Venice, Turin, Brussels, Paris. These were not wasted years. They were his education. Law studied the Dutch banking system, the most sophisticated in the world at the time. He studied the Bank of England, founded in 1694, and the early experiments with paper credit in London. He saw how a small amount of gold could support a much larger flow of commerce if managed correctly, and he developed an idea that was radical for its time. Law believed that gold and silver were not the source of a nation's wealth. Trade was the source of wealth, and trade was constrained by the scarcity of money in circulation. If you could increase the money supply without inflation by backing it with something other than precious metals, specifically with land, you could unlock unlimited economic growth. He wrote this up. The Scottish Parliament read it and said no. Philippe of Orleans read it and said yes. Law's plan had 3 phases, and each one was genuinely innovative. Phase 1, the Banque Générale, 1716. Law established France's first private bank with royal backing. The bank issued paper notes, livres on paper, not in coin. These notes were guaranteed by Law's own capital and by a specific royal promise. The notes would always be redeemable at the face value of the coin at the time of issue. This was crucial. Previous paper money in Europe had always depreciated because governments kept inflating the coin it was backed by. Law's notes were explicitly protected from this. They held their value. Within months, merchants across France preferred Law's notes to actual coin. The notes were easier to transport, more uniform, and more reliable. Trade picked up. Tax revenue increased. The French economy, for the first time in decades, began to breathe. Philippe was delighted. In 1718, he nationalized the bank. It became the Banque Royale, with the full faith of the French crown behind it. Phase 2. The Mississippi Company, 1717. While the bank was succeeding, Law proposed something else. France held vast territorial claims in North America, the Mississippi River Basin, Louisiana, vast stretches of the continent. These territories were theoretically worth enormous wealth, but had never been developed. Law proposed to develop them. He created a company to colonize and exploit these territories. He sold shares. He promoted it aggressively. He promised investors returns from the gold, furs, and agricultural wealth of the New World. Phase 3. The Merger, 1719. This is where Law's plan became genuinely revolutionary and genuinely dangerous. Law proposed to buy out France's entire national debt, all of it, the 3 billion livres that had been crushing the kingdom for decades. The Mississippi Company would absorb the debt, converting it into company shares. In exchange, the company received the right to collect all of France's taxes. Think about what this meant. John Law now controlled France's central bank. He controlled France's largest corporation, and he controlled France's tax revenue. He was, in practice, the entire French financial system. To understand the Mississippi Bubble, you need to understand one mechanism: reflexivity. When share prices rise, people borrow money to buy more shares. Rising prices attract more buyers, which makes prices rise further, which attracts more borrowers, which makes prices rise further still. The feedback loop works perfectly, until it doesn't. Law used the Banque Royale to turbocharge this loop. He printed new livres to lend to investors who used them to buy Mississippi Company shares. More money in circulation meant prices rose. Rising prices attracted more investors. More investors needed more loans. More loans meant more money printed. Between January 1719 and January 1720, Mississippi Company shares rose from 500 livres per share to 10,000 livres per share, a 2,000% increase in 12 months. Paris went insane. Nobles sold their country estates to buy shares. Servants became millionaires. A new word entered the French language: millionaire, coined specifically to describe the new class of paper rich that Law's scheme created. The street where shares were traded became so crowded with buyers that people were injured in the crush. Law himself was treated as a genius. The regent gave him the title of Comptroller General, the equivalent of finance minister. A Scottish gambler was now running France. The problem was underneath the surface. The Mississippi Company's actual revenues, the real income from the French territories in America, were essentially zero. The land existed, the gold and furs were largely fictional. Law's entire scheme rested on the promise of future wealth that had not yet materialized, kept aloft by continuously printed paper money. And Law had printed a great deal of paper money. The money supply of France roughly doubled between 1718 and 1720. Prices began to rise. Inflation crept in. Investors who had made fortunes on paper began to quietly convert their shares back into coin, real metal, not paper. They noticed that the livres were beginning to buy less. A few began to sell. Then more. Then, in February 1720, a prince of the blood, a member of the royal family, publicly converted 10 million livres in paper into coin and loaded it onto carts to be transferred to Brussels. The signal was unmistakable. The insiders were leaving. The collapse happened faster than law could contain. When the prince's gold carts were spotted leaving Paris, confidence cracked. Within weeks, thousands of investors tried to convert their paper money simultaneously. The Banque Royale did not have enough coin to redeem the paper it had issued. It had printed too much. Law tried everything. He banned the private holding of gold above a certain amount. He made it illegal to transport gold out of France. He tried to force merchants to accept paper at face value. He even attempted to gradually reduce the nominal value of shares to deflate the bubble slowly. Each intervention made things worse. Every decree that restricted the redemption of paper proved that the paper couldn't be redeemed. Every law against gold hoarding confirmed that gold was more valuable than the paper. By December 1720, the Mississippi Company's shares had fallen back to 500 livres, exactly where they had started. In 12 months, 10,000% had evaporated. France's national debt had not been paid. It had been converted into worthless paper. The middle class that law had briefly created had been wiped out. The peasantry, who had seen prices double and triple without their wages rising, were devastated. Law fled Paris in a borrowed coach. He went to Venice, where he spent his remaining years gambling to survive. He died in Venice in 1729, nearly bankrupt. Here is the uncomfortable truth about John Law. He was right about the theory. The fundamental insight, that economic activity is constrained by the money supply and that expanding credit can expand prosperity, is correct. It is the foundation of every modern central bank. The Bank of England does it. The Federal Reserve does it. The European Central Bank does it. What Law got wrong was not the theory. What he got wrong was the constraint. Paper money works as long as the issuer maintains discipline about how much is issued relative to the underlying productive capacity of the economy. The moment you print more money than the economy can absorb, you get inflation. And the moment inflation becomes visible, you lose the confidence that makes paper money work at all. Law removed all constraints. He printed to inflate the bubble. Then he printed to defend the bubble. Then he printed to pretend the bubble wasn't deflating. Every major financial crisis since 1720 has followed the same basic script. An asset inflates beyond its real value, supported by expanding credit. Insiders exit quietly. The exit becomes visible. Confidence collapses. The crash clears the excess, but not before ordinary investors are destroyed. In 1720, John Law proved something that economists have been arguing about ever since. Money is not gold. Money is not silver. Money is confidence. It is the collective belief that this piece of paper, or this number on a screen, represents real value. The moment that confidence breaks, for any reason, rational or irrational, the value disappears. Not slowly, instantly. Law's mistake was not that he invented paper money. His mistake was believing that confidence could be manufactured indefinitely through more paper. It cannot. Confidence is grounded in reality, and reality eventually reasserts itself. 300 years later, we are still running Law's experiment. We have gotten better at managing the confidence. We have not changed the fundamental dynamic. If you want to understand money, how it works, why it fails, and what it reveals about human nature, subscribe to Masters of Value. Next week, the man who predicted the 2008 crash 15 years before it happened.